I'm upgrading the ignition coils on my Beams 3S GE in my A86. So I run the blacktop Beams 3S GE out of a Toyota Altezza, and I decided it's time to swap to a different ignition coil. The stock coils on this engine with the stock ECU, there's two different ones, and you have to run the specific one for the specific ECU, and it gets a little nitpicky, and you have to run that coil. You can't just run any other one. I've heard some rumors of like a Yaris ignition coil or something working, but I've never verified that. I use a standalone ECU anyway, so I figured that while I'm trying to make the car easy to service, I should probably get some ignition coils that aren't as picky and they're easier to source. So I'm changing from the stock ignition coils to Audi R8 ignition coils. So in this video, I'm going to show you what it takes to install these Audi R8 ignition coils on your Beams 3S GE. We'll start with doing a side-by-side comparison, we'll go through the wiring, and then also the adapter plate to be able to bolt it all together and look real nice. Here we have our fancy Audi R8 coils, and then we've got our stock coils. I decided that these are the coils I want to go with because they've been proven in performance, motorsports, whatever. They've got a high capacity output. They're a pretty quality ignition coil. They're easy to get. These ones I ordered from FCP Auto. I also got the connectors and the pigtails for them from FCP Auto. You can source them from wherever. Okay. The ignition coils, they're a 4-wire, just like the stock ones are also a 4-wire ignition coil, but there are some differences. I'll get into that in a minute when we go through the wiring. You'll notice right out the gate when you set them next to each other, there's a huge difference in height. So that's why you need an adapter plate, is because that's like, I don't know, 1.5 inches taller, the Audi R8 coils. So they would set up super high, and without the adapter plate, they would just wobble around and wouldn't have a nice solid firm hold on them. The stock coils use a bolt to be able to secure it into the valve cover. These have these, like, I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but they've got these little tabs here. And those little tabs are what locate it and hold it in place instead of having a bolt. And it's rubber, so it's nice and soft. And that's why you have the adapter plate, is because the adapter plate actually sits into these little slots and holds them nice and tight. We'll go through the wiring differences and then show how to install it here. So both of these are smart coils. They've got the igniter built in. Toyota uses 4 wires on these. You've got a power, you've got a ground, you have your ignition trigger from the ECU, and then you also have this ion circuit. Now the ion circuit on the Toyota ignition coils and the Beams, and I think on pretty much any other Toyota coil, from my understanding, is that it's like a diagnostics connector, or a diagnostic circuit. So the ECU and the coil actually will like pass information along, or like the ECU will use that to verify and test the other circuits. So for example, if you've got a shorted ignition coil, or you have other circuits that are shorted, I think the ECU will use that ion circuit to tell what's going on. And the R8 coils are also a 4-wire connector here, but it's a little different. You've got a power, you've got your ECU trigger, and then you have 2 grounds. You don't have a diagnostic circuit like you do on the Toyota ones. And I'm not sure why that is. There's probably a little difference in diagnostics or whatever, but these are pretty simple. Just to wire it, we'll have to add a secondary ground. The wiring for these is actually pretty straightforward because it uses the same pin numbers between the Beams connector for the ignition coil as well as the Audi R8 one. So for example, pin 1 on the Beams coil is a black with a white tracer, and that's actually the power, the battery power going to the coil. The same thing on the R8 connector, pin 1 is your battery power going to it. Pin 2 on the Beams connector is the ion circuit. We're not going to use that, so when you go to swap these coils in, you're not going to use that pin. Then pin 3 is your ignition trigger from the ECU to the coil. So pin 3 on the R8 coils is the exact same. It's your ignition trigger. And then pin 4 on the Beams connector is also a regular ground. The difference between the two, really the only pin that you have to worry about, is pin 2. That's the secondary ground on the Audi coil. So you're going to have to run a secondary ground off of that connector to somewhere else on the engine. I wouldn't recommend tying it in with the other pin 4 because then you could be overloading the ground, and we want to do that. So just be aware you're going to have to run another ground wire. I've already gotten things moved out of the way here, so I took off the shroud. I disconnected the PCV hose that goes from here. That guy's gone. That's the fresh air vent that normally goes to the intake tube, and gotten access to everything. I already pulled the coils out. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4 connectors right here. Easy to get to. Now this is the adapter plate. I got this from Brad Burnett. He's a A86 enthusiast, and he's been pretty awesome for the Beams community. He started making these Audi R8 adapter plates, or coil covers, what do you want to call it. It's a beautiful piece. I don't know if it's laser cut or water jet cut, but it's got everything perfectly fit to bolt in down here nice. It's even like got these nice crisp bends in them to match the contour of the valve cover. and it's got a nice wrinkle black powder coat on it. It ships with a hardware kit, so you've got some Allen bolts, some washers, and some spacers here, so that way it sits up off of the head and bolts in perfectly like from the factory ignition coil bolting points. There it is sitting down in there. It's nice. That looks really, really good. Like, that just looks so beautiful in there. It looks so nice. It fits perfectly, like even in some of these little spots here. Yeah, that's awesome. Before I go cutting these connectors off and starting the wiring, I just wanted to talk about a couple of different ways that you can do wiring. Some people like to do crimps. Some people like to solder. Personally, I'm a solder guy. I know there are some people who are going to disagree with me on that. I've been doing it for years, no problems on motorsports or OEM applications. One of the other important things for when you're doing solder or crimping is to make sure you got a good heat shrink tubing. Now, this is just some cheap Harbor Freight stuff, but it's a marine grade is what they call it. And what that means is that when you heat it, you've got a glue inside that actually comes out and glues everything together, gives you a nice watertight connection. One thing I definitely need to point out here is that the R8 coils may take an extra amount of power, battery power, to fire off, just because they are so much more powerful, they need more amperage. So the wiring that you have stock on the beams wiring harness may not be sufficient. I don't have any proof of this one way or the other right now. I haven't tested it yet, so that's just something to be aware of. Is the main power wire going to the coils, the black with the white tracer, this guy right here. You might actually need to jump that up a size in wiring gauge. This is just a rough estimate on gauge here. Looks like it is a 16 gauge. Yeah. It might be a 16 gauge or an 18 gauge. So just a heads up of you might need to change the actual size of it. That way you don't burn up the wiring. It works out pretty good. I was a little worried about the length, but with how these are clocked in here, it actually should work out pretty well because the coils kind of point this way. So the wiring is going to kind of go up and do these little loops around for each of the coils here. Now that we've got the wiring at least sorted out, not necessarily tidied up, I want to get the actual adapter plate bolted in, which comes down to getting these spacers in the right spot, getting them to stay there while we put the adapter plate in place and bolt it down. This gets a little tricky, so we don't nudge the spacers as we set this down in here. It's not too bad because you could have put the spacers in the spark plug holes and slipped your fingers in to line them up, but this worked out okay for me putting the spacers down first. All right, now we're going to put all the ignition coils in. There's one thing I noticed when I was test fitting earlier that I'll show you here in a moment. So between the PCV fresh air vent here and the ignition coil for cylinder number 2, it's a really tight fit. So what I had to do was just take a screwdriver and put it in the end here and then just kind of twist it a little bit. Like, you don't have to put a whole lot of force into it and it'll move. So that way you can get it lined up where it needs to be so you've got the space. Now for the secondary ground, which is the green wire on these connectors, what I did was I brought them together on 2 cylinders at a time and tied it into one wire, one black wire, because that's ground to me. I did the same thing on the other one. So I've got these 2 black wires here. There's a big stud with a nut here on the back, right down here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take these 2 and join them with a ring terminal that I can bolt down under that nut, so that way I've got it grounded back here. I've got my secondary ground added because the primary ground is actually over here. All right. Now to tidy up the wiring so it doesn't look so bad, and the last bit of this is getting the cover to fit over it. Because some of the stuff has moved around a bit, getting the cover to fit down might require some modification and trimming. So let's just take a look real quick and I'll show you what I mean. Like, it just does not want to sit down because of how the wires are ran. So I'm gonna have to adjust some things in here to try and get it to fit better, because the wiring is now running right here, and it's just hitting on some stuff. So we've got these little pegs here that I'll probably just have to cut off and pull the insulation out right here. Here's the end result of the trimming here. So there were 3 posts like these for bolt holes. I trimmed all 3 of them down. I'm trying to smooth them out as best I could. I just used a Dremel. And then I also had to trim this for the coil for cylinder number 1 there. If this is something that you're going to do yourself, I would look at, you line it up right here with this second one in, and that's about where the coil lines up on either end. And from the outside, just drill a hole here and here on the corners. You want to line up the height with about what the oil cap is. You drill holes in the corner, and then trim it from the inside here. And here we have the finished product all wired in. Wires tucked and tidied up, and everything pretty much ready to go. Here's a good spot. You can see how much I had to trim the ignition coil to poke through. When you're looking directly over, it's just a little bit there. I already started up and ran it. It works great, still runs, so I didn't ruin anything. One of the other things you might have to think about is having your tuner change the dwell time of the ignition coils. These you might not need as high a dwell time. I'm not really sure what the factory dwell time is, so just be something aware of to have a conversation with your tuner. But there you go, there it is. Make sure to check out my other videos for other beams, 3SGE install guides, and AE86 guides, as well as all my other drifting content and stuff like Drift Week. Thanks for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, share.